France, July 1944. The fields near St. Lo were silent except for the hiss of rain and the distant growl of engines. German tank crews sat in their Panzer IVs, tense, waiting for the next American push. Through binoculars they could see nothing, only smoke and the faint shimmer of movement behind the hedgerows. Then it began. A formation of Sherman tanks advanced in perfect rhythm, 5, maybe 6, gliding across the mud as if guided by a single mind. When one halted, the others shifted. When one opened fire, the rest adjusted instantly, shells striking German positions in terrifying precision. There were no flares, no visible signals, no shouted orders, just coordination that seemed unnatural in battle. Inside the German tanks, confusion spread. "How do they move like that?" one crewman muttered. No one answered. The truth would only emerge months later, when captured American tanks were inspected and engineers found the secret hidden inside: radios. Not a few, but in every Sherman, in every platoon, connecting every commander to every gunner in a seamless web of communication. The Americans weren't just fighting, they were talking, and that changed everything. By the time American tanks rolled through Normandy in the summer of 1944, their most powerful weapon wasn't steel or fire, it was information. Every Sherman, from the lead vehicle to the rear supply tank, carried an FM radio set that linked it to the others. In an age when most German armored units still relied on hand signals, flags, or messengers, the U.S. Army had quietly built a battlefield network that turned chaos into orchestration. The story began years earlier, long before the first Sherman crossed the Atlantic. In the interwar years, U.S. military planners studied one lesson above all others from World War I: confusion kills. In the trenches of France, entire offensives had collapsed because units couldn't communicate. So in the 1930s, when the Signal Corps began developing new portable radios, the focus was not on power but reliability. The breakthrough came with frequency modulation, or FM, a cleaner, less interference-prone technology that Germany's high command dismissed as impractical. While Hitler's engineers were perfecting tank armor and high-velocity guns, America's were perfecting sound. They designed compact sets like the SCR-508 and SCR-528, rugged, simple, and able to operate even in the roar of battle. By 1942, these radios were being installed in every M4 Sherman that left the factory floor. No longer would tank commanders have to wave flags or shout over engines. Now a single voice could direct an entire armored column with split-second precision. The results were invisible but profound. In the North African desert, early U.S. tank formations had been clumsy, slow to respond, and easily ambushed. German commanders mocked them as rolling coffins, confident that their Panzer's superior guns and optics made them untouchable. But after Tunisia, everything changed. The Americans began fighting as a system, not as scattered crews. When one Sherman spotted a threat, every tank nearby knew about it instantly. When a German tank was detected behind a ridge, coordinates passed by radio brought down artillery in seconds. And when confusion struck, a calm voice on the net restored order. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. By 1944, as the Allies landed in Normandy, that invisible advantage had matured into doctrine. Every platoon leader, every tank commander, every company HQ was connected through a standardized chain of radio communication. Orders no longer crawled across the battlefield. They flew at the speed of sound. To the Germans, this level of coordination seemed impossible. Their tanks, especially in the later years of the war, were masterpieces of engineering, powerful, precise, and deadly at long range. But they were also isolated. Only command tanks typically carried full radio sets. Ordinary panzers often relied on prearranged signals or visual contact, and once smoke or terrain blocked their view, units became blind. A German platoon could have superior firepower, yet lose the fight simply because its tanks couldn't talk to one another. Captured German officers would later admit they had underestimated this completely. They had focused on physical dominance, armor thickness, gun length, speed, and overlooked the quiet revolution happening in American electronics. The U.S. Army had built not just tanks, but communication ecosystems. Behind every Sherman on the front line stood a signal corps network stretching back through command posts, artillery units, and supply depots. It meant that even when outgunned, American units could adapt faster, reposition quicker, and recover from mistakes that would have doomed others. In a war where seconds meant survival, that speed was everything. It was what allowed U.S. tank battalions to maneuver around German ambushes, coordinate with fighter bombers overhead, and execute combined arms assaults with machine-like precision. To the Germans watching from the other side of the hedge, it looked like uncanny teamwork. Tanks moving as if they shared one brain. They didn't. They shared a frequency. The irony was that Germany had once led the world in radio technology. Before the war, companies like Telefunken and Lorenz produced some of the most advanced radio equipment in Europe. But under Nazi centralization, innovation was restricted by bureaucracy and secrecy. Different branches of the Wehrmacht refused to share designs, and as a result, their equipment became fragmented, specialized, and incompatible. America, meanwhile, standardized everything, from tank radios to field telephones, and then mass-produced them in the hundreds of thousands. It wasn't genius. It was logistics, but it worked on a scale the Germans could never match. By the time Allied tanks broke out of Normandy and raced across France, the full impact of that invisible network was undeniable. German officers trained to exploit confusion found none. Wherever they struck, the Americans seemed to anticipate the blow. Wherever they retreated, the pursuit came faster than their reports could reach headquarters. It wasn't luck. It was communication. By 1944, communication had become the bloodstream of American warfare. From the Normandy beaches to the hedgerows of St. Lo, radio traffic filled the air, clipped voices, call signs, and bursts of static that carried life and death instructions. Every armored unit spoke its own dialect of efficiency. Red 1 to Red 2, shift right. Blue leader, target at 11 o'clock. Fire mission, grid 298, request immediate. The Germans, listening in with captured equipment, were stunned by the speed and clarity of the messages. Where they had grown used to long pauses between orders, the Americans seemed to act without hesitation, their commands flowing like a continuous conversation. To them, it looked like improvisation. In reality, it was doctrine, the result of years of deliberate design. The U.S. Army had learned that technology alone wasn't enough. Communication had to be trained into muscle memory. Every tank commander, radio operator, and platoon leader learned standardized procedures for brevity, discipline, and coordination. A tank platoon's radio net connected every vehicle to its leader, while the company commander maintained a second channel to battalion headquarters. If one tank was hit, another instantly assumed its role on the network. There was no paralysis, no waiting for orders from above, only seamless adaptation. It was this web of voices that transformed the Sherman from an average tank into a collective weapon. A single vehicle could spot a target, relay its position, and within seconds an entire line of Shermans would shift, fire, and suppress the threat. Artillery batteries miles away could be alerted before the Germans even finished reloading. Fighter bombers circling overhead could be directed to strike hidden tanks or retreating convoys with uncanny precision. It was the first real glimpse of what modern, networked warfare would become. The Germans had no equivalent. Their doctrine still depended on the presence of a commander, the Panzerführer, who coordinated attacks through visual cues and voice commands. In ideal conditions, it worked brilliantly. German tank units were renowned for their discipline and tactical cohesion, but in the chaos of real battle, in fog, dust, or darkness, that dependence on sight and proximity became fatal. Once the Panzerführer was killed or his radio disabled, the entire formation could unravel. Captured reports from German field officers repeatedly mentioned their disbelief at the speed of American coordination. One account from the 2nd Panzer Division, written after the battles near Mortain in August 1944, reads, "Their tanks move as though controlled by a single command post. They concentrate fire on one target, then vanish. We cannot react quickly enough." Another officer, interrogated months later, said, "We were always one order behind. We fired, and they were already gone." That difference, the space between recognition and reaction, defined the course of the campaign. In modern terms, the Americans had shortened their decision cycle. They could observe, decide, and act faster than their enemy. And in war, that gap was everything. Behind this advantage lay America's greatest strength, standardization. Every Sherman, whether built in Michigan or Ohio, carried the same controls, the same engine layout, and the same radio configuration. Any crew could enter any tank and instantly operate it. German crews, by contrast, dealt with constant variations: Tiger, Panther, Panzer IV, each with unique radios, frequencies, and maintenance quirks. Where American units spoke the same technical language, German formations struggled with incompatibility and shortage. The logistical system supporting this network was equally astonishing. Radio components were mass-produced in hundreds of factories, tested, packed, and shipped with meticulous precision. The Signal Corps maintained mobile workshops that could replace an entire radio set in hours. Even in the mud and cold of the Ardennes, the flow of communication never stopped. German intercept operators listening through static often marveled at the discipline, and sometimes at the sheer amount of traffic. It was as if every American unit, from the smallest patrol to the highest division, existed within a single living organism. That organism had a voice, calm, relentless, always connected. It gave U.S. armor the ability to coordinate with infantry, artillery, and aircraft in ways no other army had achieved. When the German lines began to crumble after the breakout from Normandy, that voice guided the pursuit. Columns advanced day and night, communicating over multiple frequencies, bypassing resistance, and linking with supply convoys that never lost their way. The Germans called it the War of Movement, but to the Americans it was simply communication working as designed. Historians later compared it to an orchestra, every unit an instrument, every radio a note. Individually, the Shermans could never match the firepower of a Tiger or the armor of a Panther. But together, united by voice, they created harmony out of noise. The Germans had built tanks to fight duels. The Americans had built tanks to fight wars, and that difference, the invisible thread of sound that tied one machine to another and would soon turn tactical battles into unstoppable momentum across an entire continent. To the American tank crews, the radio wasn't just equipment, it was lifeline. Inside a Sherman, visibility was limited to narrow periscopes. The world reduced to flashes of light and color through steel slits. A single tank was nearly blind, but when connected by radio, it could see through 20 other sets of eyes. The battlefield stopped being chaos and became conversation. Every crew learned the rhythm early. The commander spoke in short, clipped bursts. Contact left, 200 yards. Range fire. The gunner responded instantly, aligning his sight. The loader slammed another shell in place. Across the net, a second voice, another tank confirming, adjusting, adding fire. It was a language of survival, spoken in calm tones even when shells tore through the air. To outsiders, that calmness seemed unnatural. But it was discipline born of trust, not just in their machines, but in one another. Each crew knew that somewhere out there another voice would answer when called. That kind of coordination built confidence that armor alone could not. In contrast, German crews often operated in silence. Even elite panzer units equipped with superior optics and long-range guns fought as individuals rather than as a synchronized force. When a Tiger tank took a hit, neighboring vehicles might not even know until it was too late. If the commander's radio failed, confusion rippled through the formation. And once coordination broke, even the most powerful tank became little more than a target. For American soldiers, communication became the equalizer. They knew the Sherman wasn't invincible. Its armor could be pierced by nearly every German anti-tank weapon. But they also knew something the enemy didn't. Teamwork could turn weakness into advantage. When one Sherman was destroyed, another filled its role. When a flank was exposed, the radio closed it. The network itself became armor, invisible, unbreakable. The psychological effect on German troops was profound. At first, they dismissed the Shermans as crude, mass-produced machines. Easy to destroy, easy to outrun. But as battles continued, they began to notice something unsettling. Where one Sherman appeared, more always followed. Perfectly timed, perfectly positioned. It was as if the Americans could read their movements. To the German crews, it felt supernatural. In truth, it was just coordination at scale. Captured panzer commanders later described the frustration vividly. One recalled an engagement near Falaise. We hit the first tank at 600 meters. It burned. But before we could reload, 3 others had turned their guns on us. Their shells landed before I finished my order to move. He didn't realize that as his first shot was fired, an American radio operator had already reported his position, and within seconds, An entire platoon had adjusted their aim. The advantage grew sharper as the war pressed east. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, where visibility was limited and terrain confused even veteran units, American communication became decisive. German armor relied on initiative and instinct. The Americans relied on coordination. And coordination, even when slower, was more consistent. That reliability extended beyond the battlefield. Supply convoys, artillery batteries, engineers, all shared the same communication logic. Every truck, every gun, every headquarters could talk. It made the U.S. Army less like an army of men and more like a living network. Flexible, self-correcting, impossible to cut off completely. The Germans had learned to destroy enemies by isolating them. But how do you isolate something that can talk to itself? Technologically, the contrast was staggering. The U.S. Signal Corps deployed over 400,000 radio sets in the European theater alone, enough to connect every vehicle, aircraft, and outpost. Each one used standardized frequencies, simple controls, and interchangeable parts. Meanwhile, German forces struggled with shortages, inconsistent frequencies, and delicate AM systems prone to interference. Their engineers built brilliant equipment, but too little of it, too late, and too complex to maintain. The human difference mirrored the mechanical one. The Americans trusted the system. The Germans trusted the man. In the Wehrmacht, hierarchy ruled. Orders flowed downward, authority never questioned. In the U.S. Army, initiative was encouraged, especially among lower ranks. If a lieutenant went down, the sergeant picked up the radio and kept the fight moving. That flexibility, multiplied across thousands of units, became unstoppable. To German officers trained on rigid control, it was chaos, but it was efficient chaos. An American armored company could change objectives mid-battle and still maintain formation. They didn't need to wait for written orders or runners. They could adapt faster than the Germans could think, and that was the true genius of the system. Not the technology itself, but the culture that used it. The radio didn't make Americans better soldiers. It simply allowed them to be human, to think, react, and communicate in real time. It gave them the one thing totalitarian militaries feared most: freedom of thought. That freedom, amplified across every Sherman rolling through Europe, became the silent weapon of the war. And for the German army, trapped in its own hierarchy, blind behind its armor, it was a weapon they could neither see nor stop. Behind every calm voice crackling across the radio net, there was a vast army of engineers, mechanics, and signalmen who never fired a shot. They were the quiet architects of the invisible war, the ones who kept the Shermans talking. Every tank division carried mobile signal corps repair trucks, packed with spare vacuum tubes, amplifiers, antennas, and soldering irons. In the mud of Normandy or the frozen forests of Belgium, these men worked through the night repairing radios damaged by shell fire or soaked in rain. They used field generators to test frequencies, rewired transmitters with trembling hands, and calibrated microphones so that even under fire, a single word could carry clearly through the static. They weren't glamorous soldiers, but without them, the entire system would have gone silent. Their work was guided by a principle that defined the U.S. Army in World War II. Standardization breeds strength. Every radio part was interchangeable, every wiring diagram familiar. If a unit's equipment failed, another could replace it within hours. A German tank crew might have to wait days for a specialized technician. An American crew had replacements by sundown. The same discipline extended up the chain of command. Field manuals dictated how each level of communication worked, from a platoon net to a division headquarters. When a Sherman transmitted, it didn't just speak to other tanks. It could reach artillery units, reconnaissance patrols, and air support with layered precision. That structure allowed commanders like George S. Patton to wage an entirely new kind of warfare: fast, fluid, and constantly informed. Patton understood better than most that communication was the real engine of movement. His Third Army moved hundreds of miles across France in just a few weeks, consuming tens of millions of gallons of fuel. It wasn't raw aggression that made it possible. It was the radio. Every truck driver, tank leader, and logistics officer was connected in one living chain of sound. Convoys shifted routes within minutes of receiving new orders. Bridges were built before tanks even arrived. German commanders thought the Americans were improvising. In truth, they were coordinating faster than any army in history. The contrast with German doctrine was striking. By 1944, German radio production had begun to collapse under bombing and resource shortages. Many late-model Panthers and Tigers went into battle with faulty sets or no radios at all. Commanders often used messengers or colored flares to direct movement, signals that worked only in clear weather and daylight. Once chaos struck, units fragmented. The myth of perfect German precision met the reality of broken communication. When the Allies captured German tanks and equipment, they were often surprised by the quality of the engineering and by the scarcity of radios. The Germans, in turn, were stunned by what they found inside American machines. Each Sherman carried not just a radio, but multiple headsets, intercom systems for every crew member, and standardized frequency markings etched into the controls. It was a system designed for anyone to use, simple, robust, and industrially perfect. It reflected the American philosophy of war, not excellence through complexity but through replication. Captured officers began to piece together what had been happening. Interrogation reports from late 1944 reveal a recurring theme: confusion over how the Americans coordinated their armor so effortlessly. One colonel captured near Metz admitted, "We could not understand how they appeared everywhere at once. Now I see what their tanks were never alone." For him, the discovery was devastating. The weapon Germany had never seen wasn't a tank or a plane. It was a voice, but even after realizing the truth, there was little Germany could do. FM technology required materials and expertise they no longer possessed. Factories were in ruins. The Luftwaffe had lost control of the skies and resources were collapsing. By the time German engineers began experimenting with their own versions, the war was already ending. Meanwhile, the Americans kept refining their network. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, communication was the difference between disaster and recovery. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive, it was the radio nets that held the U.S. lines together. Units cut off and surrounded in the snow still managed to coordinate artillery strikes, call in air support and report positions, all through the same reliable equipment that had carried them from Normandy. The German attack depended on silence and confusion. The Americans answered with clarity and connection. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in 1945, German resistance was crumbling, not only under bombs and shells, but under the weight of an enemy that always seemed to know where to move next. The speed, unity, and precision of the American advance stunned the Wehrmacht's remaining commanders. Some believed the Americans had developed new intelligence networks or radar-guided coordination. In truth, the secret had been riding beside them all along, in the radios mounted inside every Sherman. After the war, German officers studying American tactics admitted they had underestimated something fundamental. They had built a military machine around strength and command. The Americans had built one around communication and trust, and that difference changed everything. By August 1944, the roads of northern France were alive with motion. The fields that had been battlefields only weeks before now trembled under the roar of engines, the hum of generators and the hiss of radios alive with voices. The Allied breakout, Operation Cobra, had begun, and with it came the full realization of what the Americans had built. A war machine that could think aloud. German defenses had been designed for a predictable enemy, one that paused between assaults, waited for orders, and took time to regroup. But when the Shermans began to roll, the rhythm was unlike anything they had faced before. Columns shifted routes mid-march. Tanks turned flanks without signals. Artillery arrived where it was needed without messengers. And above it all, fighter bombers circled, responding to coordinates relayed by calm voices on open frequencies. To the Germans on the ground, it was chaos. To the Americans inside their tanks, it was coordination. When the order came down to advance through the Saint-Lô-Perrier Gap, Patton's armored divisions moved like a living organism. Every tank was part of a single chain of thought, connected through the invisible pulse of radio waves. Tank commanders spoke to platoon leaders who spoke to battalion HQ, who spoke directly to air support. In the space of minutes, entire battle plans evolved, something the German command system, bound by hierarchy and paperwork, could never match. One German officer watching from a hilltop near Avranches later recalled his disbelief. They moved faster than our maps could record them. By the time we reported their position, they were gone. The secret wasn't just the radio. It was the trust behind it. American commanders delegated authority freely, allowing junior officers to make decisions without waiting for higher approval. That autonomy, combined with constant communication, created a tempo that overwhelmed German logistics. Convoys were ambushed and overtaken before they could reroute. Bridges were captured intact because American tankers arrived faster than demolition orders. Entire regiments vanished in the fog of mobility. By early August, German command posts were flooded with conflicting reports. Some claimed the Americans were moving east toward Paris. Others insisted they were still pinned near St. Lo. Both were wrong. The truth was that the Americans were everywhere, their armor fanning out across roads and fields with terrifying precision. The Germans had never seen war fought at that speed. When Patton's Third Army was unleashed on August 1, 1944, its momentum was unstoppable. In just 12 days, it advanced more than 400 miles, capturing towns before the Germans even realized they were threatened. To achieve that level of coordination, Patton's staff relied on constant radio contact, not just with his armored divisions, but with engineers, logistics officers, and fuel convoys. The famous Red Ball Express, the massive truck network that kept his army supplied, operated entirely through radio dispatches. Every driver carried a receiver, every depot a transmitter. If a bridge collapsed or a road clogged, new orders arrived within minutes. It was logistics conducted at the speed of conversation. The Germans, in contrast, were suffocating in their own silence. Field units often went hours or even days without communication from headquarters. Destroyed cables, jammed frequencies, and overburdened runners left commanders blind. When messages did arrive, they were already outdated. By the time counterattacks were planned, the Americans had already moved on. At Mortain, the German army made its last desperate attempt to cut off the Allied advance. Hitler himself ordered the offensive, sending several panzer divisions west to strike the American flank. For a moment it worked. Heavy fog grounded Allied aircraft and German armor punched through thin lines. But the Americans' radios never stopped. Even in the fog, tank crews relayed coordinates to artillery batteries they couldn't see, and the shells fell with uncanny accuracy. Forward observers, half-blind in the mist, coordinated by sound and timing. When the skies cleared, American pilots received the full picture within minutes and turned the counterattack into a massacre. Captured German officers were stunned. One report from the 2nd SS Panzer Division stated, "Their artillery fire adjusts faster than we can move. Their tanks shift position before we can flank. Every time we advance, they are already waiting." The Americans weren't waiting, they were listening. Every movement, every sighting, every burst of gunfire was transmitted through the network. It allowed them to fight not as isolated units but as one connected force. It was the birth of modern command and control, decades before the term existed. To the soldiers inside those Shermans, it felt almost natural. They spoke through static, through chaos, through noise. The voice on the radio was constant, a tether to the larger whole. Sometimes it was a commanding tone, sometimes just a calm reassurance that others were still alive and fighting. That psychological connection mattered as much as the tactical one. In a war defined by confusion and death, hearing another human voice meant hope. By late August, as Paris fell and the German army reeled eastward, even the most hardened panzer commanders began to admit what had gone wrong. Their tanks were superior, their crews were skilled, but they were fighting alone, each in its own silent battle. The Americans were fighting together, every tank, every truck, every plane connected through invisible threads of coordination. When the Allies crossed the Seine, the German command structure fractured completely. Messages from the front stopped coming. Telephone lines were gone, radio channels jammed or broken. Meanwhile, American tank divisions advanced faster than their own supply columns could keep up. Yet even that problem was solved through the same network that had brought them victory. They simply spoke to one another, adapted, and kept moving. What Germany called disorderly pursuit, the Americans called communication in motion. And in those last weeks of summer 1944, that motion became unstoppable. The sound of an army that could talk faster than its enemy could think. The Ardennes forest, December 1944. The cold had turned everything to stone, trees, rivers, and men alike. Snow fell in thick silence, muffling the sounds of an army that had been lulled into believing the war was nearly over. Then, before dawn on December 16th, the silence shattered. Artillery thundered across the hills. Tracer fire tore through the fog, and German armor surged from the trees like a ghost from another war. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. For days, confusion reigned. German columns wearing American uniforms sowed chaos behind the lines, cutting phone cables and ambushing convoys. The sudden offensive hit the U.S. front like a hammer, scattering units and isolating outposts. Many American formations lost contact with headquarters entirely, at least by landline. But where the telephones went dead, the radios still lived. Inside freezing Sherman tanks dug into the snow, radio operators worked through numb fingers, adjusting frequencies, clearing static, keeping channels alive. Even as the Germans advanced, those voices carried through the blizzard, calm, urgent, steady. Reports of enemy movements reached command posts within minutes, allowing generals to react faster than the Germans expected. One colonel later said, "We were blind but never deaf. That difference would decide the battle." The German plan, Wacht am Rhein, relied on speed and secrecy. Their goal was to exploit bad weather, jam communications, and cut through the thin Allied line before reinforcements could organize. But they hadn't counted on how deep the American communication web ran. Even isolated outposts had shortwave sets capable of reaching nearby units. Even surrounded divisions kept transmitting, sending coordinates, weather reports, and enemy positions long after they'd been written off as lost. In Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, radio operators became the link between defiance and despair. While artillery shells rained down, they kept the channels open, coordinating airdrops, calling for medics, guiding reinforcements through the snow. When Patton's Third Army turned north to relieve them, those same frequencies carried the orders that made it possible. The Germans thought they had sealed the pocket. They hadn't. Sound travels through snow. Elsewhere along the front, tank crews used their radios like lifelines. In the fog, visibility dropped to nothing. German armor ambushed convoys and supply trucks, but within moments, word spread through the network. Every tank, every gun, every company knew the danger before it reached them. They shifted positions, blocked roads, redirected columns, all through voices in the dark. The Ardennes was chaos, but the radio cut through it like light through smoke. Even when German infiltrators captured American vehicles, their silence betrayed them. They didn't know the call signs, the cadence, or the tone of real American transmissions. It wasn't just language, and it was rhythm. The real crews spoke like veterans of countless drills, clipped, confident, efficient. The imposters stumbled, and when they did, they were found out. In a war of words, even accents could save lives. For the Germans, the problem was the same as always: isolation. Their tanks had limited radio contact. Their fuel convoys were out of range, and their command posts often didn't know where their own units were. Once the offensive began to falter, that lack of communication became fatal. The more they advanced, the further they drifted from coordination. By contrast, the Americans, and even while retreating, remained united by invisible lines of speech. Patton later said, "We moved faster in that snow than the Germans could think." He wasn't exaggerating. His staff used radio coordination to reroute entire divisions in real time, bypassing bottlenecks and feeding reinforcements into the fight with clockwork precision. At one point, when his tanks ran low on fuel, he personally radioed his logistics officers and ordered fuel convoys to meet him halfway, something unthinkable in the German command system, where decisions took hours to climb and descend the chain of approval. By late December, the skies cleared. American pilots, guided by ground radios, began striking German columns trapped on the roads. Each strike was coordinated live from the ground, tank crews relaying targets to artillery, who relayed them to air controllers, who guided fighter bombers overhead. It was a complete circle of communication, executed in seconds. For the Germans, it was annihilation. Entire columns burned before they could even return fire. One captured German captain, interviewed after the battle, said quietly, "We had surprise. We had courage, but they had radios." It was a confession more revealing than he realized. When the offensive finally collapsed in January 1945, the American lines were scarred but unbroken. The communication network, battered, overloaded, constantly repaired, and had survived. Every message that mattered had reached its destination. Every unit that could fight had been guided to where it was needed. It was not technology alone that had saved them, but the discipline to use it even under the worst conditions imaginable. The snow melted. The silence returned, and as the Americans prepared to cross into Germany itself, their greatest weapon remained invisible, the shared voice that turned machines into unity and soldiers into a single thinking force. For the German army, that winter was more than a defeat. It was revelation. They had fought their last great battle in the old way. Command from the top, courage at the front, and chaos in between. The Americans had fought in the new way, connected, coordinated, fast. The future of warfare had spoken, and it spoke in English through static and steel. By the spring of 1945, the German army was no longer fighting a war of conquest. It was fighting to survive. Its once proud armored divisions were ghosts of their former selves, reduced to scattered battalions short on fuel, ammunition, and hope. Yet even in those final months, German commanders were still trying to understand one mystery that had haunted them since Normandy: how the Americans had managed to move, coordinate, and strike with such impossible speed. When captured officers were interrogated by Allied intelligence, the answer was already clear to their captors, but shocking to the prisoners. It wasn't a new tank or a secret weapon or even overwhelming manpower. It was the radio. Every Sherman, every half-track, every command car in the U.S. Army had been part of a single network. One that allowed the Americans to think faster, move faster, and recover faster than any army in history. In the closing battles along the Rhine, the effect was unmistakable. The U.S. 1st and 9th Armies coordinated river crossings, artillery barrages, and airborne drops with precision that seemed mechanical. German resistance collapsed not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because their leaders couldn't control them. Orders issued at dawn were meaningless by noon. The front was already miles away. When Allied columns reached the Ruhr industrial region, their speed stunned the defenders. Entire garrisons surrendered without a fight, unable to organize a defense before the Americans had already surrounded them. In their reports, German generals described the Americans' method with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. One wrote, "Their command was everywhere. Their eyes and ears never rested." Another, reviewing the campaign for a post-war study, admitted, "We underestimated the value of communication as a weapon. We believed in strength. They believed in control." The difference went beyond tactics, it was cultural. In the German army, control was vertical, flowing from generals to field commanders to soldiers. In the American army, control was horizontal, shared across units that trusted one another to act. The radio made that trust possible. It turned individual initiative into collective precision. Even when a commander was killed, his men could keep fighting intelligently because they were still part of the conversation. That conversation extended far beyond the battlefield. In depots and headquarters, teams of Signal Corps officers tracked every frequency, every channel, ensuring that no unit was left unheard. Messages relayed from tank radios were logged, transcribed, and routed through the entire chain of command. It was information warfare before the term existed, the transformation of war from a contest of arms to a contest of awareness. As Germany collapsed, captured equipment and intelligence confirmed what Allied engineers already knew. The Wehrmacht had never managed to standardize its communications. Different panzer models used different frequencies. Infantry radios couldn't connect to tanks or aircraft. Even within a single division, coordination often depended on a handful of command vehicles. Once those were destroyed, entire formations went silent. The Americans, by contrast, had built redundancy into their system. If one tank was lost, another instantly filled its place on the net. If a company's radio failed, another frequency took over. It was resilience by design, an industrial solution to a tactical problem. After the war, German officers studying U.S. operations for the Allies were candid about their failure. They called it the invisible front, the realm of coordination and speed where America had achieved dominance. Many admitted that had they understood the full scope of the system earlier, they might have fought differently. But by 1944, it was already too late. The Americans weren't just winning battles. They were redefining the battlefield itself. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, and the remnants of the German army laid down their weapons, That invisible weapon, the radio network, had become the silent proof of how modern war would be fought. Not through sheer destruction, but through connection. Not through the loudest explosion, but through the clearest voice. When the war ended, the world's armies disarmed their guns, but they didn't silence their radios. In fact, for military strategists, the lessons of the American Sherman were just beginning. The war had proven a truth that would define the rest of the century. The side that communicated best would always win. In occupied Germany, Allied officers and engineers examined the wreckage of the once feared Wehrmacht. They studied the tanks, the weapons, the vehicles, and found brilliance trapped in isolation. The Tiger and Panther were marvels of design, but they were mute giants. They fought alone, commanding nothing but the ground beneath their tracks. By contrast, the Americans had turned every Sherman, even the humblest, into part of a chorus. Together, those voices had drowned out the silence that doomed their enemies. For the U.S. Army, the victory validated everything it had built and pointed toward the future. The Signal Corps, often overshadowed by the more glamorous branches, was now recognized as one of the decisive factors of the war. Its engineers, who had labored in obscurity, became the architects of a new kind of military thinking, one where information mattered as much as firepower. As the United States transitioned from wartime to occupation, those lessons were institutionalized. New doctrines emphasized command, control, and communication, the first outlines of what would later be known as C3 systems. Tank radios evolved into vehicle intercoms, then into battlefield networks linking infantry, armor, and air support in real time. The principles that had guided the Shermans in 1944, speed, coordination, adaptability, became the foundation for every operation that followed. The same logic extended into diplomacy and alliance building. When NATO was established in 1949, its entire command structure was modeled after the American system of interlinked communication. For the first time, different nations' militaries trained on shared frequencies, standardized signals, and compatible procedures. It was a direct descendant of the network that once guided Shermans through the hedgerows of Normandy. The radio had evolved into strategy, unity through connection. German officers now serving in the new Bundeswehr under Allied supervision acknowledged the irony. They trained with American-made equipment and studied manuals that reflected everything their old army had ignored. Where once the German doctrine had exalted the individual tank ace, the new doctrine exalted coordination. They understood now that a single voice commanding 10 tanks was more powerful than 10 tanks fighting alone. The influence spread far beyond Europe. During the Korean War, American armored units once again relied on the principles first tested in France. In Vietnam, radio coordination guided helicopters, artillery, and infantry through jungles where sightlines vanished but sound carried. By the time satellites entered orbit, the same idea had expanded into a new dimension: global communication as the nervous system of war. From the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, every modern military traced its lineage back to the same realization: that the first true networked army had rolled across Europe in Sherman tanks. Even in the civilian world, echoes of that wartime revolution endured. The research into rugged field radios laid the groundwork for post-war advances in telecommunications. Many of the engineers who had worked on the SCR-508 later contributed to early mobile phone systems and FM broadcasting networks. The same technology that once carried battle commands would one day carry voices across peaceful continents. For the men who had lived it, the memory remained vivid. Tank commanders who had survived the fire and mud of Normandy often said that the voice on the radio, calm, familiar, always there, had been their anchor in the storm. Decades later, at reunions and memorials, veterans would still recall those crackling transmissions that cut through fear and chaos. To them, the sound of victory wasn't the roar of the engine or the blast of the gun. It was the voice saying, "We see them. Hold your fire. We've got them." In the end, the story of the Sherman's radio wasn't about machines at all. It was about connection, the human instinct to reach out, to speak, to organize in the face of uncertainty. That instinct had turned ordinary soldiers into something greater than themselves. And though the world would change, the principle remained. Wars might be fought with new weapons, but they are still won by those who can talk, listen, and act together. In war, Power is often measured by what can be seen, by armor, by guns, by destruction. But the story of the Sherman's radio revealed something far quieter and far more enduring. It showed that the most powerful weapon on the battlefield isn't noise or fire, it's connection. For the Germans, victory had always meant domination. For the Americans, it came to mean coordination. And that difference, whether invisible, technical, almost mundane, reshaped the modern world. Every time a Sherman commander keyed his microphone and spoke into the static, he was doing something revolutionary. He was turning war from chaos into conversation. He was proving that communication could move faster than destruction, that a group of men could think as one, even while surrounded by smoke and death. In that clarity, in those crackling bursts of radio chatter, lay the true sound of American strength. The Germans built machines that terrified. The Americans built a system that endured. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't beautiful, but it worked. Relentlessly, precisely, and together. That was the genius of democracy in motion. The belief that unity, not fear, creates order. Decades later, when veterans looked back on those long, hard miles across France and Germany, they rarely spoke of killing. They spoke of voices. Voices that guided them, reassured them, connected them. The memory of that sound never faded, because the war's great secret wasn't that American tanks were stronger. It was that American soldiers could talk to each other, and that made them unstoppable. In the end, victory didn't belong to the side with the loudest guns. It belonged to the side that listened best.